So last week we started once again on the topic of obstacles and never quite finished it, and we're going to start again this week. And if we don't finish all of them this week, we'll continue next week, because it is an important topic for us to explore. And as I said last week, my hope or my intention, my purpose for these talks along this line is to just try to take the mystery out of our spiritual growth. Dr. Holmes said a mystic is not a mysterious person. A mystic is someone who just has a deeper experience, a deeper realization, a deeper contact with the presence of the divine within. That's all we're talking about. We're not talking about conjuring up spells or all these other things that Hollywood would have us believe. I think of the movies about Rasputin, the Mad Monk, and they always show him with these glazed eyes, kind of a madman. That's kind of the way that pop culture paints things that they don't understand. That Tesla was portrayed as a mad scientist in the cartoons as well, because people didn't understand what he was trying to say. And of course, a lot of the modern technology we use today passed through his consciousness. So we want to take the mystery out of this idea of what is this thing called spiritual growth. And we want to discuss the obstacles that we as people, we as spiritual beings evolving in our spiritual experience, we as spiritual beings taking the journey, our own individualized journey on the spiritual path. There are some things that we collectively we tend to bump into, and if we know what they are, we can recognize them when we encounter them. And if we recognize them when we encounter them, we can not get so caught up in the reality of them, and the stuckness of them, because they are all, each and every one. They are all simply ideas, simply delusions of the mind, if you want to call them that. So we started out this series of talks over the last couple months. We started talking about where do we come from and where do we go? Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? Are the great questions of life. And we realized then that the only place that we could come from is the one, the unity, the one source, by whatever name it is called. We call it God. Some people have trouble with the word God. We call it love, because love is the experience of unity. And this is why I believe Scripture says God is perfect love. And if you don't know love, you don't know God. Because if God is perfect unity, perfect oneness, perfect wholeness, excuse me while I drink, that if we are to know God, we are to know that perfect unity, that perfect experience, that perfect wholeness. So we come from that. It has created us out of itself. And this is one of the first things that we kind of awaken to, we kind of come to in our spiritual realization, is that matter does not create spirit, but spirit creates matter. I often tell people the only question you ever really need to consider is, did matter create consciousness, or did consciousness create matter? That's the key question to discuss. Now, of course, materialism would say, why, it's matter that has created consciousness. Spirituality would say, something doesn't come from nothing. Consciousness created matter as its tool to use it. And you're going to have to wrestle with that question. You're going to have to find where you come down on that question, you see. But the position that I'm taking is that we come from the oneness. We come from this complete whole, this singularity this unity, this perfect love, and we come into this experience here on earth. And while we are here on earth, we begin to remember. We get signs and wonders. I chuckle when I say that because I don't mean like, walking on water kind of things. But we get these little inclinations. We get these little inclinations along the way that there's more to life than what we see. And we begin to awaken. We begin a journey of awakening. For some folks it's sudden. For some folks it's gradual. For some folks, not in this lifetime, wherever they go next perhaps. But it is our destiny. It is the destiny of each and every one of us to awaken and to seek earnestly this experience that we long for, that part of us remembers. Remember, I read the poem from Rumi a couple of weeks ago, and he said, we're like the reed flute. We are like the reed flute. We have been cut from the riverbed, but we know that, and we long to go back home. And the breath that blows through us, that makes the music, is the very breath of God. And the notes that come through the flute are the longing of the reed to go back home. There's something within us that knows, and it knows that it wants to go back. And this is kind of the spiritual journey that we were talking about. Different cultures have different kind of explanations of how did we find ourselves in this situation. I always chuckle. It's like the joke in Texas about the turtle on the fence post. It's a political joke, but I'm going to leave the politics out of it. Like the turtle on the fence post. You see a turtle up on a fence post, you don't know how it got there, but you know it had help. So how did we get here? How did we get here? Of our own doing? No, we did not. We did not create the bodies we live in. We did not create the life that animates them. Did our parents create our life? Or were they instruments and vehicles through which this new body began to take form? But the persona that animates it and the life that animates it is part of something else. And it is from this unity, from this oneness that we come. And in Book of Genesis, we were taught about the fall of mankind, that mankind entered into the experience of the knowledge of good and the knowledge of evil. Not the reality of good and the reality of evil, but the knowledge of good and evil. And because of that, we left the garden. See? And there's two guards. We talked about this last week. There's two guards at the gate, two cherubim in the Judeo-Christian culture. And in Buddhism, you have a similar mythology. There are two ugly guards standing at the mouth of the cave, and the Buddha is inside meditating peacefully. Remember I mentioned they represent our fears and our desires. What keeps us from entering back into that which we long to get back into? It is our fears and it is our desires. And what are fears and desires? But they are also ideas. So I likened this last week to the hero's journey. Of course, I didn't invent that, and neither did Joseph Campbell. He kind of did a lot of research into it. But the hero's journey is our journey. It is your journey. It is my journey. It is about someone who is awakening from their normal life, their everyday life, the mundaneness sometimes, if you will, of the things that we do, that we fall into routine and habit. And suddenly the hero receives this call. There is something bigger for them to do. There is something different for them to do. There's something vital for them to do. And that's just, to me, this is us awakening to the desire to discover our spiritual nature. And that desire itself is not something that we created. but it is something that has been placed within us to ensure that we find our way back home. Meister Eckhart said that God is like the child who clears its throat while playing hide and seek to make sure that we find it. It was Augustine who said we would not have the desire to pray if God had not first placed it in our hearts. There is something already within us that comes to awaken, and we don't get to choose if it's going to happen. We can kind of wrestle with when it's going to happen or how it's going to happen, but it will happen. If it has not already happened, it must happen, because it is for this purpose we have come. So in the hero's journey, the hero begins to awaken to the call, but then the hero refuses the call. I was thinking of this morning. I can't tell you how many of my colleagues in ministerial school would say when they first became aware of the idea that they should go into the ministry, they sat in devout silence and said, God, you sure you got the right person? You talking to me? I think you got the wrong one, But eventually we come to respond to the call. We come to recognize that it is, in fact, our calling. And we must begin. Now, sometimes we begin and there's false starts. We take 2 steps forward, we come back. We take 2 steps forward, we come back. Sometimes that is part of the journey as well. The tales of the Knights of the Round Table, if we step back and look at those as a mythology of the soul, the Holy Grail that they're looking for is the presence of the divine within. It's not a cup. It's not a chalice. It's the quest of the human soul to find the presence within. And there's one tale of the knight whose quest is to find the holy city. And like all of the quest, he answers the call, and then he has to go through trials and tribulations on the way, and he eventually finds the holy city. And everybody welcomes him as a new king. They're all happy that he's there. But one day there's a knock on the door of the castle, and it's his page who has come back from Camelot and said, Sir Knight, have you forgotten you've got business back in Camelot? And the knight tells the people, he says, the page is right, I have to go close up some affairs. I have some things to sell. I have things to take care of, but I'll be back. And he goes back to Camelot, and he gets so involved in the day-to-day life in Camelot that he forgets again all about the holy city. So sometimes our quest is like that, right? And that's the meaning of that story. At least that's the meaning that I take from that story. That is the meaning of that story. We begin to awaken. We become very excited about our awakening. We wish to do everything we can to awaken, and then all of a sudden we find ourselves back in the things that we do for a living. At some point we begin, I would say, in earnest. There's nothing going to stop us now. We're going to begin the quest. And one of the next steps on the journey, as Joseph Campbell lays out, is meeting the mentor. If you're a fan of the Star Wars movie, of course, I mentioned George Lucas had conversations with Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell kind of went over this journey with him, and this is really what you find in the character of Luke Skywalker. And Luke Skywalker meets Yoda, little old green kind of Muppet-looking guy who's just chock full of wisdom. And slowly he teaches young Luke all of the things that young Luke is going to need to know along the way. Tells him the obstacles that he's going to face and tells him how to overcome them. So this is the purpose of the mentor in the mythology. Now, when it comes to our personal mythology, when it comes to our hero's journey, when we begin to awaken to the fact that we are on this journey, that we are the hero of the hero's journey, we are the protagonist in the story of our life, our own life, then we come to meet the mentors, the teachers, the guides, the instructors. Sometimes it's a book, sometimes it's a tape or a talk, sometimes it's someone we meet in person, sometimes it's a community of people. But we kind of meet the resources we need to meet at that point in our journey to get us moving. Sometimes we start with inspiration. We always start with inspiration. We always start with feeling wonderful that this is something that we can and should do. And we meet the mentors who tell us about the obstacles. So luckily there are people, wise people, good and kind people, loving people who have gone before us thousands of years and who have kind of laid out for us a map. Not the only map, but a map. A map. And this is important because each one of us has to find the map that works for us. We have to find our path. So on this journey, then, part of the map that is laid out are called the obstacles. In Buddhism, they're called the kleshas, K-L-E-S-H-A-S. And Dr. Holmes told us that some of the finest organized thought on spiritual growth comes to us from the East. And he in fact, read books that come to us from the East. And you can, as I go back and read some of these older texts, older than the Science of Mind texts, it's easy to see, where he was influenced by some of these ideas. So Thomas Troward, who is kind of like, I would say, ground zero for New Thought in England. At least that's the way he's romanticized today, as Quimby is in the United States. But Thomas Troward was an Episcopalian who was in India as a judge, and he understood the similarities between Christianity and Hinduism. So he came back, and a lot of times writers will say Troward is where East meets West. If we step back from the color and the costume and the characters that we encounter in the different mythologies, we can see that in fact they are representing the same things. If you just study the mythology of the Greeks and the mythology of the Romans, you can see that they have the same gods go by different names. So it's not the name that's important. It is not even the image that they conjure up for the God that is important. It is what it represents. It is the representation that is important. So if you wish to read further during the week, if you wish to study further during the week, what you're looking for is the 5 kleshas, K-L-E-S-H-A-S. And what the ancient teachers are telling us. Now remember, we are on a journey of the soul. We are on the journey of discovery. And where do we discover anything? Where do we discover? Now we might say, well, we discover where we come across it. If I'm on a trip and if I get off the boat in Italy, I discover Italy in Italy. If I am studying science, I might discover it in a textbook. I might discover it in a laboratory. But we need to take a step back further and say, well, physically you may have been in Italy. Physically you may have been reading a textbook. Physically, you may have been in a laboratory, but the experience occurred within you, within this thing that we call consciousness. The only place that you and I experience anything is within our consciousness. Now, you and I, as human beings, we can do something that perhaps no other creature on earth can do. We can become aware of thinking. We can become aware of emotion. We can become aware of thoughts. We can watch them come. We can watch them go. We can choose whether or not to act or react. We can choose whether or not to engage. And what we learn is that we become the witness or the observer of the activity that appears within our field of consciousness, rather than sort of a puppet who must dance every time a particular thought goes through our heads. Right? So what I'm saying is, if an angry thought goes by, we think I'm angry, and we begin to behave as if we are angry, slam doors and put things down in a rough fashion and all of that, because we think that we are angry instead of thinking that we have observed an angry thought. So this is very important to keep in mind. Let me get another drink here. Where we experience everything is in our consciousness. Even if I am in an electronics lab and I've got a meter and I am measuring the current in a circuit, I can say, well, I looked at the meter and it says there's 2 amps running through that circuit. But my experience of the meter took place in my consciousness. Excuse me. So everything that we experience is in our consciousness. All of the obstacles that we encounter are in our consciousness. And we are the only ones in the entire world who can alter our consciousness, who can desire to alter our consciousness, who can become aware of our own thinking and thoughts. We are the only ones who can do it. Now, along the way, as we grow into our experience, of course, as our consciousness comes into contact deeper with the divine presence, it is the divine presence, or as the theologians might say, it is grace that produces change. But we have to prime the pump. We have to get the ball rolling. We have to have the intention. Life becomes a lot simpler if you recognize that our primary role is to select an intention. And that once we have that intention, then there is a power in the universe that responds to us according to that and helps that to come into fruition. And most of the time we are unaware of that, and we act as if we're unaware of that. We go through life not paying a bit of attention to our intentions. But that's the secret of life. What do you intend to have happen right now, this instant, right here? Why are you spending this hour together today? So the first category of obstacles that we come into and we must reflect upon is sometimes, now I just want to mention that sometimes the obstacles are referred to as poisons or aversions. These are things that take us away from. These are things that poison us on our path. These are things that prevent us from doing the very thing that we say we want to do, which is to have a deeper experience of the spiritual truth of the universe, of the presence of the divine within us. And the first one is sometimes called ignorance, sometimes called a lack of understanding. But it's a lack of spiritual understanding. Now here's the problem that we run into, is that we human beings, we have an intellect. And the intellect likes to analyze things, it likes to divide things, it likes to understand things, it likes to manipulate things, you know. As you go through your social media, you see so many posts that says, well, the average person only got this much on the test. Where do you, oh, we want to take that test because we want to prove we're smarter than everybody else. So the intellect is constantly trying to know and to understand and come up with an explanation that makes sense, right? That makes sense to that particular intellect. And what we have to realize is that many of the things that we figure out are not true. And just because something makes sense to us doesn't mean it's right. If you look back over history and all of the things that made sense to people, that are just absolutely wrong. I mean, at one point, doctors believed that putting leeches on people's bodies or cutting their veins to let the blood out, that these sorts of things were healing practices. And now today we would say, oh, that's just a superstition. So we believe that we understand. We believe that we understand. Now, where did our understanding come from? Our understanding came from our previous experience. And where was our previous experience? Our previous experience is in our consciousness. Something happens, excuse me, there is an event, we assign meaning to it. We think about it, we assign meaning to it, we file it away in our pigeonhole, in our filing cabinet of the brain, and we think we know all about it. Excuse me, another sip of water. But we don't know about it. We only know what we have decided about it. So what we must recognize is that this lack of spiritual understanding, this spiritual ignorance, this not seeing things as they really are, but as we think they are. Right? In Buddhism, we're told over and over again, all we want to do is see things as they are. And immediately when you say that to somebody, they say, well, it's like this, it's like this, it's like this, it's like this. And then we have to go to the neti. No, it's not this. No, it's not that. So we have this misunderstanding of the spiritual nature of the universe. We believe that the physical things that we see around us are the only things that are around us. We believe that this life or this lifetime is the only lifetime. We believe that we are born. We believe that we die. We believe that matter has created spirit. We believe that matter has the power to create sickness. And none of these things are necessarily true. So the first obstacle, the first problem that we have, the biggest problem that we have, the biggest obstacle that we have along the path of our spiritual growth is the unlearning, the letting go, the willingness to acknowledge that everything that I have ever believed, everything that I have ever said is possibly wrong. And I'm willing to let that go. See, that's the other problem, is we want to be right and we don't want to be wrong. You know, look at what's, playing out in pop culture right now. Boy, oh boy. Our candidates sure hate to be told if they're wrong. But in our spiritual growth, on our spiritual path, we have to be willing to be willing. We have to be willing to let go. In Plato's Republic, he gives us the example of the cave. When the man escaped the cave and he comes back in and he tells everybody inside, he says, there's a whole different reality. What you think is real is not real at all. It's only a shadow of the real world. And they told him he was crazy. They told him he was crazy. They wanted to believe that the experience that they had in their consciousness, the experience that they decided was the real experience, that it was right. And you can see that around us. It's easier to see it in other people, of course. But if we can get back far enough, we can see it in ourselves. How many times do we cling to the need to be right? Somebody says something to us, or somebody does something to us that, excuse me, would point out that we were wrong, and we immediately run around trying to garner support, you know what Jim said to me? He must be wrong, and we run around and tell everybody we can possibly tell, and what do we get from them? We get feigned sympathy, to go, oh yeah, oh that's terrible, oh he never should have said that. So we have to be willing to be wrong. We have to be willing to let go. We have to be willing to come back and then try to ask ourselves, what is this thing called spirit? If we come from the delight, we come from the unity, we come from the singularity, we come from the oneness, and we are here in this experience of imposed ignorance, is the best way that we can put it. Imposed because of the fall, whether that fall be the fall being kicked out of the garden because of the desire to know about good and evil, or whether that fall be the fall of spirit into matter, as it is explained in the East. We have to recognize that where we are is in an experience of imposed ignorance. And therefore we cannot assume that everything that we assumed to be true is true. We must be willing to let go. We must be willing to say that everything that I have ever known is possibly wrong. Now this raises another question then of how do we know things? And where do we experience things? And we already established that where we experience things is in our consciousness. But we tend to believe that the only way that we can know them is through a process of what comes to us through our five senses that is then acted upon by logic and reason. And of course that's not true. A lot of what comes to us at the level of emotions and has nothing to do with logic and reason. Nothing to do with logic and reason. But there's another knowing. There's another knowing. This is the gnosis I was talking about. G-N-O-S-I-S. There's another knowing. Be still and know. Be still and know. In Christianity, Jesus tells us to go within, to seek the kingdom within, to close the door on our prayer closet, right? To shut out the outside world and to commune with the Spirit within. There is a knowing that is beyond the process of logic and reason. There is knowing beyond the intellectual knowing. There is knowing of being taught by the teacher within. And as we come into our awareness of spiritual understanding, our process of knowing moves from the intellectual process of study, of listening to talks, of dedicated prayer and treatment, to a period of listening, Just listen. Joel Goldsmith, in his work of The Infinite Way, asks his students to meditate 5 times a day. And he asks at least one of those periods be for absolutely no intention, no purpose, no mantra of love, no running of thoughts through the brain. Just simply be still and know. And then he advises them that at the end of that particular meditation period, to remind themselves that through this meditation, a deeper desire to experience God has entered the world. A deeper desire. So what we want to do is we want to catch ourselves. Right? So think about this for a minute. Is that many of the things that many of the practices, the spiritual practices that we engage in, as well as secular practices that we engage in, as well as perhaps some of the addictions that we engage in as human beings, all in some way kind of slow down that intellectual knowing, interfere with that intellectual knowing. Remember, excuse me. Remember the analogy of the priceless gem is laying in the mud in the pond, just below the surface, just within arm's reach, but we can't see it because we're flailing about and the surface waters are all rippled and the sunlight is reflecting off and we've kicked up the mud and now we can't see the very thing that we're looking for. But if we can learn to calm the surface of the mind, see, these are all of the ideas, these are all of the chatter of the monkey mind, these are all of the things that are coming to us a million miles an hour. But if we can learn to calm those down, to still those, to be still and to know, then we can see the gem that is already there. So the very thing that we are seeking is seeking us. The very thing that we are seeking is already within us. We don't have to create anything anew. It's not about plussing. Emmett Fox says that spiritual growth is not about plussing, it's about minusing. It's about letting go. Letting go of the things that we know to be true that get in the way, and in fact, they are not true. So I remember when I was a young boy, I was growing up in the Catholic Church, and we would go to a high mass, like on Christmas or Easter, and it was a fantastic special occasion. The church building was built in such a shape, that just entering it kind of had a feel to it. Joseph Campbell says when he entered the caves in France, he had the same feeling as being in a sacred place, a sacred geometry, a cathedral. There's something about just the geometry of the building that feels special. The stained glass windows that kind of filtered the light that comes in, the flickering of the candles, the smell of the incense, the chants of the choir, and then the repetition of the prayers. Some of the prayers were call and response. The priest would say something, and then the congregation would repeat back, and the priest would say something, and the congregation would repeat back over and over and over. We'd say the rosary, and the priest would say the first part. The congregation would say the second part of the Hail Mary. And it gets you into this altered state, a state where logic and reason kind of begins to shut down, and there's a different experience to be had. So if you look at the different practices of different religions around the world, many of them include something like that. Meditation is a deliberate attempt on our part, a deliberate activity on our part to distance ourselves from the activity of the mind. Some of the substances people become addicted to interfere with the activity of the mind. Some of the daredevil activity that people engage in requires such intense focus of mind that they can't let anything else come in, They are so focused in the moment at what they are doing that the activity of the intellect, as it applies to anything else, must come to a complete halt. When I was running years ago, there was a phenomenon. They talked about the runner's high. You run and you run and you run and you start to get into this rhythm. You start to get into this pattern. Your feet are hitting the ground. Your lungs are moving in and out. The world about you is going up and down. And then after a while, you're just in what they call the zone. Being. Not necessarily thinking. Certainly doing. But not necessarily thinking, not necessarily bothered by the monkey mind, the chatter of the monkey mind. So the first obstacle and the most important obstacle, and clearly we've got 4 more to go, so we're going to continue next week. But the first obstacle we wish to consider, and I invite you to consider it this week, is spiritual misunderstanding. Spiritual misunderstanding. One simple thing that we can do is mindfulness, which is to try to catch ourselves forming our opinions. Try to catch the chatter that goes back and forth inside our head when we see something. And just very simply say to yourself, perhaps, perhaps. In the Wednesday night group, we used to talk about a story that comes to us from Zen. And when Pete was with us, he used to love it. He used to just say, perhaps, perhaps. And whenever things would come along, an opinion would come up later on, he'd say, perhaps, perhaps. And the story is something like this, and I'm going to leave you with this story. This is the practice for the week, if you wish to accept it. This story takes place in China a long, long time ago, and there was a man there who had a young boy, a teenage son, and the man had a little farm, and he had a mare, female horse, in a corral. And one day the mare got away, and all the neighbors came, and they kind of offered their condolences to the man, and they said, oh, it's terrible, terrible thing. You only had one horse, you had one mare to plow your fields with, and she's run off. Oh, it's terrible. And he said, perhaps. Well, 2 days later, the mare returns, and she brings a herd of wild stallions with her. And they return to the corral, and the farmer is able to fix the fence. And now, in addition to the mare, they've got these other horses that they can tame and they can sell. And the people of the town come by and they say, oh, aren't you a lucky man? Aren't you a lucky man? Yesterday you had no horse at all, and now you've got 4 horses. And they're beautiful stallions, and you can break them and you can sell them, and you can become wealthy. Aren't you very, very lucky? And he said, perhaps, perhaps. So his teenage son goes out to try to break the horses for riding, and the horse bucks him off, and the boy breaks his leg. And everybody comes by and says, oh, how terrible, your son was thrown off the horse, and he's broken his leg, and now he can't work on the farm for a while, and oh, it's just terrible. And the farmer said, perhaps, perhaps. And then a warlord passed through the town, and he was gathering up an army to go do battle against another warlord. And he conscripted all of the healthy young men in the village, but he didn't take the boy with the broken leg. And now everybody goes to the farmer and they say, aren't you lucky? Our sons were carried off to war, but your son didn't have to go because he had a broken leg. You're a lucky, lucky man. And he said, perhaps, perhaps. I invite you this week, as you go through the week, try to catch yourself forming your opinions. Try to find the ideas that you're so totally in love with, you know. Try to find the things that you're defending or you feel outraged against if somebody says anything against them, and just stop and take a breath and say, perhaps, perhaps. And see if, as you are able to become disengaged from the chatter of the monkey mind, see if a deeper understanding does not well up for you. The gifts have already been given. Everything you need and want is within you. It is all a matter of consciousness. You are the only one in charge of your consciousness. This week I invite you to exercise more dominion, more control. Be willing to accept the fact that everything you have ever thought is possibly wrong. And be willing to allow the knower within to instruct you. Next week, we'll pick up with the second obstacle, which is ego. Until then, be well. And so it is.